Good morning, everybody. Great to see so many people here early on a Sunday morning for this next event in our Dublin Festival of History. And sorry to bore those of you who have already been at events, but do want to say that the festival is supported, funded, sponsored by Dublin City Council, and it's organised by Dublin City Libraries and the Dublin City Council Culture Company. And we have lots of fantastic events for you here today in Dublin Castle, and then over the next 2 weeks or so in various venues around the city, including our public libraries, but also lots of partner organisations. So pick up a programme if you don't have one, and maybe have a look at the website, because we have added a few more things to the programme as we've gone along. So we're going to kick off with more recent history, something that we don't do that often, but I think it's important that we look at the full range of Irish history, that we look at how we got to where we are today. I'm delighted to have three people who are going to be moderated by Frank McNally. Frank is well known to you all from in the Irish Times, and particularly from the Diary. We have Diarmaid Ferriter. Diarmaid is troubling for librarians, because if he keeps publishing books at the rate he is, we'll have to have an entire section in the library for him. But great to see him. His latest book, The Revelation of Ireland, which looks at the most recent past here in Ireland. Mick Clifford is a well-known investigative journalist. Many of you will know him from his work on the Maurice McCabe story, and his latest book is called Who Killed Una Linsky? And then we have Caelainn Hogan, and her book will be well known to many of you. She's a writer and a journalist. She's interested in things like inequality and politics and legacy, and her book Republic of Shame really hit home hard when it was published recently. So we're looking forward to hearing what they have to say about the trouble with recent Irish history. So would you please welcome your panel? Thank you.
What a fantastic crowd on a Sunday morning. I'm so glad that so many people don't have something better to do at 11 a.m. I'm going to talk to the panel for about, I think we have an hour, right? So I'm going to talk to the panel for maybe about 40 minutes and then throw it open to the floor. I'm sure you will have many questions. I'm going to start with my old friend Mick Clifford over here, who's a career journalist like myself. And Mick, journalism is famously the first draft of history, and you wrote many of them, I think, in this very room.
I did, Frank. I'd just arriving here this morning, I had a great sense of deja vu. Instinctively, I came around to the back door, because for over 10 years, that was the door we all used for the planning tribunal here. And I'm a bit disorientated now, because this is totally, this is lopsided in terms of the way it was, because I'm only noticed because I noticed where the door is. This was around this way. The judges were up here, the reporters on the far side, and the public down here. And it got out of hand, I think, as everybody knows, in terms of tribunals and that. But initially, in the early years, it was a fascinating exercise in what you, as you described, Frank, the first draft of history. In that all the revelations that came out, and this touches on Diarmaid's book, the revelation of the last 25 years, but we were treated to the minutiae of what had gone on behind closed doors. And I think it's fair to say for the first time ever in terms of the centres of power. And on one level you had that corruption about planning, but on another level, which is in some way more insidious, and this is probably something that historians will examine better than those of us who were journalists at the time. You had the transactional relationships between those in power and those who were effectively wanted to make money, business people. And the minutiae of it was fascinating at the time. And it was the first time, I think, in this country that it became clear what everybody had suspected and assumed had been going on, and that often everyone knew, I'm sure you know the story, but it was never presented in any kind of an official forum. And it was the first time that it came tumbling out, and in that detail, it was fascinating. And one element of it that I think really spoke to the times. And we're talking about the early years of prosperity, late 97 going up into the 2000s. And one thing that really spoke about what had gone on and what was coming out was the composition of the public gallery, which was over there. And as journalists, we got to know an awful lot of them because they were here regularly. And for the greatest part, they were retirees. And these people, when they had been in the prime of their lives, what was tumbling out now was actually going on behind closed doors. When they were living as far as they believed in a poor country that didn't have resources in order to make the country more developed and bring it up to the level of first world countries. When they were living through that and they were told there was no money in the coffers, all of this was going on. And they were there now, in some way this was like a Greek chorus with her, but they were there to bear witness to what had gone on behind closed doors. And it was fascinating. And to the extent that at times, when particular things came out, the audience broke into a round of applause. Now, that inside in the tribunal was quite unbelievable. And, you know, the first judge, Fergus Finlay, and subsequently there were 3 judges replaced him, and they admonished, but in a gentle way. There was an understanding that what these people were witnessing, what had gone on, and now this is the first time it was coming out. And I'm glad I was here for it, but as you mentioned, Frank, it was the first draft of history, and I suppose getting beneath those contours into what was going on below the surface, that is where the historians come in with a longer view later on. Yeah,
it struck me. You're remembering some of the great dramatic moments when moments of truth emerged. Then there were all the boring days that we've forgotten in between that, you know,
exactly,
where you had very little or nothing to write about. But that's what historians, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was days like this. There was a famous day, Frank Dunlop, who'd been a government press secretary, where he was caught in terms of they had bank accounts, they had details, and I could honestly say you could nearly feel the man shrivel inside in the witness box. His life, to a large extent, was transformed, and you know, it was only just in terms of what he'd been involved in. But you could see him shrivel inside in the witness box. And there was another occasion, the occasion years later when Bertie Ahern's secretary, Grania Carruth, was in there, and she broke down. And it was a disturbing moment because the general consensus, I think it was really expertly summed up by Miriam Lord in the Irish Times the day after, the general consensus was she'd been sent in here to defend the indefensible by Bertie, and all of that tumbled out. But it was a fascinating period, and even for those long times that there very little went on, those flashes made it worthwhile. But even in the times when things didn't go on, that detail of the relationships that were there behind the scenes, and we all were told always, these are perfectly normal in a democracy, look away, don't worry. When that came out, and it did change the way that things were done subsequently.
Caelainn, you too cut your teeth in journalism long before your great book emerged. You were, especially a foreign correspondent, you were covering stories very far away from here. I'm thinking of Syria in particular, which is, I mean, that is still spilling into history with consequences we didn't guess at 10 or 15 years ago, including the fact that my hometown of Carrickmacross, where I was last night, now has a substantial Syrian population. Just tell us a little bit about that and your experience of that, and then maybe how you see the relationship between the journalism that you wrote and the history that story is still becoming.
Yeah, I mean, the Syrian conflict is still ongoing, and there's still families and people that I would be in touch with, whether displaced or still in places like Idlib, which are under siege and still being bombed by the Syrian government today. And yet, you know, there's so much to be covered at the moment around the world. You know, you have the genocide in Palestine. You have conflicts across the world that aren't, you know, getting enough attention, that aren't written about enough. But you know, these conflicts are ongoing, and people are very quick to relegate them to the past when, you know, there's people still suffering. And I think it's interesting talking about the first draft of history as a journalist, because those in power are very quick often to relegate or to say that a draft is very, you know, finished. and to relegate abuses to history and to give the sense that something is past. And in writing Republic of Shame, having reported in Syria, in Nigeria, in South Africa, really internationally on issues of conflict and human rights abuses, I'd covered a great deal of trauma over a decade of working as a reporter internationally, but the trauma that I witnessed speaking with survivors here in Ireland was different and on a level I really didn't expect, because it was a trauma that had been silenced for generations. It was a trauma that people still today were scared to speak about, who didn't tell family members that they'd had a baby when they were younger or when they were unmarried. Who I remember one woman, I think she went to Dunboyne maybe as late as the 80s, and she had named her first child the same name as another child that she had, her subsequent child, and had never told still her family that baby existed, even though she'd never forgotten about him and she was still searching for him. And so the shame and the silence that has been imposed on survivors has really brought about a level of trauma. And the various commissions of investigation that we've seen that have dealt with these abuses and injustices as something of the dark past. That's a phrase that I see repeated all the time when we talk about the church-state institutions and the abuses that were systemic. It gives the impression that this is something in the past. And yet, writing Republic of Shame, writing my book, I was speaking to survivors who were born the same year as me, born in 1988, only a year after we abolished the status of illegitimacy. And I, investigated the castle in Donegal, a mother and baby home institution ran by the state but set up by dioceses both sides of the border, which was open until 2006. So when we talk about these as historical abuses or historical injustices, it really glazes over the fact and deliberately tries to distance the public from the fact that these are abuses that are affecting thousands of people still today. And there are, talking about where we're at right now, just across the way is a Portakabin where the GRO is located, the General Records Office, where survivors I know, and I've gone with them to try and search through ledgers of names to try and find their original birth certificate, trying to match names and dates, often with tiny scraps of information that they've been given by religious authorities or by the state, searching for their identity, searching for who they are. And that woman I know who was born the same year as me, 1988 in Bessborough, I went with her trying to find details, and with many other survivors. So this is something affecting countless people, and yet we have a redress scheme that is still excluding thousands of survivors, more than around 24,000 survivors from any form of redress. So while the government is making big apologies and setting up redress schemes and claiming that this is a history that we are dealing with, a dark past that we're coming to terms with, they are denying thousands of living people today any form of justice and really dismissing their experiences.
You remind me of the other great quote, the first draft of history is one, but the other quote that's always hovers over a discussion like this is William Faulkner, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." Diarmaid, as somebody who has just written 400 or 500 pages of history on a very defined recent period, the 25 years to up to 2020. When does the first draft and when do current events become history? Yeah. When can you draw a line under them and say, okay, I'm now going to attempt the definitive story of this period?
It's very arbitrary, and it's never the definitive story. And this is the thing about contemporary history, that it is by its nature provisional. It's tentative. It doesn't mean that you cannot be firm about particular themes and their impact. But historians always come back and they revise and they revisit and they reevaluate. They still want to be driven by evidence. But it's a real challenge for the historian to move beyond outrage. And if you consider Jim Smith, for example, who wrote about the Magdalen laundries, an important book about the Magdalen laundries, and he talked in his introduction about trying to separate your academic side from your citizen side, and moral outrage and academic detachment don't sit very comfortably alongside each other. And it is a real challenge. But I was also conscious when I was listening to Mick there about the tribunals, and Caelann's talking about the commissions and the various reports that we've had. I became interested in where they sit. Where do they lie 20 years on, for example? What is of long-term significance, and how do we evaluate that? Take, for example, you mentioned there the travails of Bertie Ahern towards the end of his political career. Are historians going to define Bertie Ahern by that stage of his career in relation to all the complications and dig-outs and various things that emerge? Or are they going to remember Bertie Ahern in relation to the peace process and being the most electorally successful Taoiseach Susaima de Valera? And I remember at the time when he was humiliated, and of course you can argue that was largely of his own making, but Martin Manser made the point to somebody who would work closely with him that we're far too hard on our fallen leaders, that we shouldn't define them like this. And we were giving the example of Charles Stewart Parnell at a much earlier stage, who was not averse at all to dig-outs from friends. They were very common in 19th century politics, and his career is not defined by that. They're documented, but they don't define the narrative. But I also became conscious of how few people actually read the reports of these commissions and the tribunals of inquiry. That's understandable because they're overwhelming. Many of them are multi-volumes, sometimes a couple of thousand pages when we think about things like the mother and baby homes, for example. There's an awful lot of reliance on the executive summaries, and they can facilitate a short-term reaction. And, there's a tendency sometimes for politicians to brandish a freshly published report and say, this is a document of truth. Now, what is a document of truth? Is there any such thing? You become very conscious as a historian that we're still really only dealing with fragments. But at the same time, there are certain events or certain reports that do encourage us to try and make sense of ourselves as a society. And that's where I see the need for a longer historical lens, so that we can look at, say, Haughey being humiliated here as well, and people remember the shirts and the luxury and the indulgences. But what's interesting is one of the conclusions from Moriarty was that such was the scale of the corruption and the payments that it devalued the qualities of a modern democracy. And when you think of that broader theme about our relationship with democracy and how seriously we take it over the last 100 years, we certainly wouldn't be considered one of the worst offenders. Quite the opposite. We would be considered a country that takes its democracy very seriously. So, even where do the conclusions of learned legal people lie in relation to the evaluations they are making? So distance and perspective does help you to come back to these particular reports and these particular events and try and see beyond the headlines. Like when we talk about contemporary history or recent events, it's really about taking the present and trying to invest it with a historical consideration or a sense of the past. One of the infuriating mantras that we heard a lot of during this period was, we are where we are. And, that is a red flag to a historian bull. How are we where we are? Why are we where we are? But there's also the tension between memory and history. The very first teaching job I had in UCD, which is 30 years ago now, I was teaching a history called Ireland in the 20th century. I was in my early 20s. And one of the students was a mature student who had retired from the public service. And he came up to me at the beginning and he said, with all due respect, which he didn't mean at all.
It's always a red flag.
What do you know about the 20th century? Yeah. I've lived through most of it. Yeah. And I said, well, I've researched a lot of it. There's a difference between history and memory, and there's often a tension between history and memory, and that's why we have interesting debates in talking about contemporary history with people who have actually lived through it, and what they remember, and what they are certain is true, is not necessarily what you might decide as a historian.
A few years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, maybe 15, the Irish Times had this bright idea during probably one of the dog days of summer when there was no news, to get a few of us to resit a Leaving Cert paper of our choice. There were about half a dozen of us. I remember Donald Clark did maths, which is a big mistake. It turned out he did A-level maths, I think, and got great mark in his, he was in Belfast when he was a kid. He got an F in his Irish Times exam. Anyway, I thought, I'm definitely not going to pick English. That would be giving hostages to fortune. So I picked my second favourite subject, which is history. I didn't revise for the curriculum at all. I just walked into it was all done in kind of honesty. We sat in a room alone for 3 hours. And what struck me, I was grateful for, was how much of the curriculum I had lived through. So I did. I wrote from memory, vague memory, and I got a C, which is just about right, I think.
Yeah. I suppose the question is, are people who lived through a particular period the best people to evaluate it?
Yeah. The biggest challenge actually was writing longhand for 3 hours, something that I hadn't done for 30, 40 years.
One element of history that fascinates me at the moment, and the writing of it, and some might suggest the rewriting of it, is the conflict in Northern Ireland, 1968 to 98, say, for argument's sake. And it strikes me that the way it's being remembered in popular culture is at odds with the way that people who were alive remembered it. But the nature of media and that today, particularly social media, has allowed for that. Now, there's a lot to be said both ways, because during the period itself, we had periods where there was an element of censorship, there was an element of people taking entrenched positions. I mean, thinking particularly, for instance, governments in the south on the basis that they wanted absolutely there to be no association with violence or what have you. But there was also other elements, and it strikes me that it's fascinating the way that is being remembered now, the way it's being written about in popular culture, which I'm guessing will probably be at variance with the long view as documented by historians in time. But which of those gets more traction? I think that's an interesting aspect today. I mean, for example, going back again, if you look at one tiny element of it, say, for instance, the role of those on the nationalist side who were opposed to violence, principally John Hume at the time, and largely he was considered by an awful lot of people, I think it's fair to say, as the leader of nationalist Ireland to some extent. But because of the plight of his party since, and because of the way politics has gone since, there's a different lens there now, and I just find it very interesting, as I say, particularly in popular culture, and how much of that, as a result of the evolution of media and social media in particular, is going to have an impact in how that period was remembered.
We might come back to social media later, because this is an interesting subject. But first, on the question of moral outrage versus academic detachment, Caelainn, it strikes me, moral outrage, it's a great force of energy. It's the sort of thing that drives you to write a book or, or long newspaper article. Mick, you would have had plenty of moral outrage on the Vincent Brown show over the years.
And it was dwarfed by Brown's outrage anyway.
How hard is it to achieve a balance to keep that in check, especially with a subject like the one in your book, which would inspire so much justifiable anger? How do you remain detached?
I don't think I did remain detached in writing that book. I mean, I'm in the book, and I try and lead the reader along with, my own investigation of these injustices and speaking with survivors, and to walk them through how I experienced trying to make sense of what I call the shame industrial complex. And part of that was to also show how recent it was. I mean, I used to, I don't drive, and so I take a lot of buses and I get lifts where I could, and you chat to people, and inevitably the book would come up, and everyone had a story. And I'm sure there's people in this room here who know someone who is a survivor, who is a survivor themselves. I don't think there's a family in Ireland that wasn't affected by this in some way, and I thought it was important to show that, to show my personal experience of speaking to people across the country who were either survivors themselves or whose lives were impacted. And one of the most significant things I think about when the book came out was people telling me that, having read it, they spoke to family members, and just discussing it, suddenly discovered that they had an aunt who was sent away, to an institution or separated from their child, and that they had family out there that maybe they never knew about. But I think it's that distance, that need to maintain a distance, can sometimes, I think, make people involved in these commissions or people investigating these issues in some way hostile to survivors in trying to maintain that distance, in worrying that they will be too subjective. They maybe distance themselves too much from the lived experience of survivors. And I think memory, it can be unreliable, and trauma complicates that. But I think the downfall of these commissions of investigation, particularly the Mother and Baby Home Commission, was to disregard in so many ways and dismiss the lived experiences of survivors, who are experts of their own experience, who know more than any of us the impact of those institutions, and who lived through their trauma again, who were re-traumatized in giving their experience and giving their testimony, only to find it missing from official reports and dismissed by official accounts. In the first page of the report from the Commission of Investigation to Mother and Baby Home Institutions, you see these institutions described as refuges. So that is the official account, that these institutions where mothers were forcibly separated in many cases from their children, where they were told they would be selfish to keep their children, who were made to work while pregnant, who were giving birth without any sort of pain medication, and ridiculed throughout, made to feel subhuman, and many of them sent to Magdalene laundries after, and their families, put through a cycle of institutionalization. For them to see on the first page of an official report these institutions called refuges was just such a betrayal and so hurtful to so many people who are still seeking justice and felt completely unheard, and that their voices were completely silenced by this report. And so I think what was important for me, at the risk of seeming, maybe too close or seeming to be giving some voice to that outrage that I do feel at that injustice, I think it was important to create space for survivors' testimonies to be heard.
It's not about one or the other, though, either, is it? It's not about academic detachment or moral outrage. I mean, an important part of writing the historical narrative is that you do have empathy, because you want to try and communicate that history through the prism of those who were living through it, insofar as you can. What did it feel like to be there? And we've moved into a new space in relation to much more of an appreciation of that. It's not so much top-down history anymore. But there can be problems when there are assertions, like when stories began to emerge, desperate stories about mother and baby homes, and about burial and abuse of that. One national newspaper said, "This is Ireland's Holocaust," which was a completely inappropriate description of it. And again, come back to the question of perspective. But there is that issue as well of official narratives, which we always have to be sceptical of. And I mean, there's an Institute for Contemporary History in Britain, which was established in 1986. And the reason the historians established it was because those with political power were fashioning their own historical narratives, which were serving their own needs during Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s. And there were certain tensions there around the idea that historians were not doing the job of teaching about the greatness of the history of Great Britain. And that they were undermining British patriotism. And I remember years ago being accused by Desmond Fennell, who was a very original thinker, of making Ireland unlovable. And I said, it's not the job of the historian to make Ireland unlovable. We do want to strive towards a degree of fairness, but it's not that function of us to try and make people proud. You can obviously point to difficulties and traumas become a huge part of our landscape now as historians. There are also significant positives that we can emphasize, again, when we're taking a long view. So it's that question of trying to strike a balance.
I think as well the fairness for me, which was important, was speaking to the nuns themselves. And I went to great lengths to speak with nuns who worked in these institutions. And it's funny because when the Commission of Investigation report came out, they claimed that there was no member of the Daughters of Charity still alive that they could speak to. And yet I spoke to a woman with the Daughters of Charity who was a midwife in the largest mother and baby home institution, St. Patrick's in Dublin. And her memory was excellent, even though the head of her order called me after to say her memory wasn't very good and maybe I should, not mind what she said. And her testimony is in the book. And I spoke to a number of nuns across the country who were actually more than willing to speak in the end, even though they felt still an institutional silence. And The nuns at Bessborough were willing to let me speak to, I think, a handful of nuns who were still alive, who worked in Bessborough at the time that it was operating. And yet then lawyers got involved and it was shut down, and I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. And there are nuns still alive whose names are on death certs of, some of the more than 900 children who died at Bessborough, who were alive at the time, whose names are on death certs and yet claim they don't know anything about where these children are buried. We still don't know where more than 800 children who died at Bessborough are buried. And the nuns' statements on these issues have been called misleading by the Commission itself. And so how do we get to that truth? And I think the fairness is in speaking to everyone and giving space for everyone to speak, but there is still so much silence on the institution.
I think and another issue with those official commissions, tribunals, reports that become in one way the official history is the terms of reference that are set out are not necessarily those that are going to bring the maximum amount of truth to the scenario. And as well, normally it's done in a legalistic framework, so people's rights get preeminence. I would imagine often a lot of people compiling them are very cognizant that they're closing off any possible legal challenge. And all of that, when you add all of that up, it can compromise a much fuller picture. And I think certainly what I've noticed in the areas I've looked at, that's definitely been the case in any kind of reports that I've investigated, particularly when you're there and you see the full evidence of what's actually gone on. I mean, the most notorious example of that, and it was hopefully an outlier, was the Kerry Babies Tribunal, which went off on a complete tangent from what it was initially supposed to investigate. But there are more benign examples of reports not delivering what you might call the full narrative on the basis that they're legalistic considerations. And they're also very cognizant of the rights of people who are still alive. And it's a balance whether or not that's
and
that's
even
correct.
that balance between the idea that a particular commission or an investigation might be there both to investigate but also to be therapeutic.
Exactly.
One of the great changes in the writing of history has been the extent to which people are bearing witness. You mentioned this as well, the personal testimony, and how we might incorporate that into our narrative. And some of the people who have to bear witness and to give testimony are people, of course, who have never had an opportunity to tell their story. And if they did have an opportunity, they were told that they were lying or that this didn't happen. But that can become very complex, for people who are then trying to bring it all together and make it public and make it accessible and make it do justice to both investigating what happened and giving due recognition to the personal experiences of individuals. I don't think there's any report that got that balance exactly right. Some of them have generated more hostility. But even if you take the Ryan Commission, which really was such a landmark, it's 25 years now since Mary Raftery and Sheila Ahern did the States of Fear programme. That led to the Ryan Commission. But you're talking about over 200 institutions. You're talking about nearly 100 years of history. And you're talking about well over 1,500 witnesses. And again, they're just a sample.
Caelainn, you reminded me when you were talking there, that quote from William Faulkner, I didn't realise this until I looked it up this morning. It comes from, I think it's a short story or a novella called Requiem for a Nun. It's not about a nun. The word is used ironically. It's about a prostitute who becomes a murderer, and apparently the title is a pun on the Elizabethan meaning of nun, which was prostitute, and also something to do with her sort of redemptive nature of the character. But do we need, I think you touched on this in the book, or maybe you certainly did in the interview that we had, does somebody need to write a definitive history of the nuns, the religious orders, the abuse scandals from their point of view, like what produced them? Were they scapegoats for society? Were they just doing the dirty work that everybody else conspired in quietly? I mean, is there a definitive work to be written about that?
Well, there were 11,000 nuns in 1989 when I started studying history in Ireland. 11,000 women in religious life. There are now about 4,000, and they're a very elderly group. And we were actually in this venue years back with Margaret McCurtain, the late Margaret McCurtain, who was a Dominican sister and also a historian. We were talking about the Magdalen Laundries. And she referred to the unexamined landscape. And what she meant by that was there's that very large cohort of women, and we don't know an awful lot about them and their formation. And also within the Catholic Church itself, the internal snobberies that worked, and of course their status as women within the Catholic Church. And that unexamined landscape as a phrase stayed with me, because it is a reminder of how little we know. I mean, you could say the same about the formation of other people in religious life, you know. I don't know if you found that.
There is a book, she's an ex-nun, Sister Camillus, I think her name is, but a fascinating book she wrote in which she spoke mainly elderly nuns about their lives and particularly how they ended up joining orders. And it's fascinating insight because you realise that the point Diarmaid makes about the snobbery within the church and the different hierarchies, there's two different layers of nuns it could be, but it's fascinating in how young these women were, girls they were at the time, when the so-called calling came, how it came. I recall vividly one recalling about she decided after talking to her mother that if the priest happened to visit the house in the next 28 days, as a priest would normally visit all the neighbourhood, if they happened to visit their house, she interpreted that as a calling. It occurred and she joined the nuns. And it's back to the context that all of them became nuns and what the implications of that were for how some of them went on and what happened under their charge.
I mean, of course, there were many women who were girls when they entered the religious orders who suffered a lot of cruelty. And I remember talking to one nun who tried to speak out about how children were treated in an institution and was essentially silenced. Another who almost wouldn't speak to me at the start of an interview and then opened up about being a novice herself in a Magdalen laundry in Cork and acknowledging how the women were, called penitents and, how they were treated inhumanely and opening up about that, when she was given the space to. Whether there can be a true history written about, the reality of the orders depends on access to records as well. And the religious orders still hold their records as private, even though, these orders were funded and maintained by public funds. And it's interesting you mentioned prostitution because Ruhama, which is an anti-prostitution organization, was set up by the nuns and received a huge amount of government funding, as too many services still run by these religious orders who incarcerated thousands of women and children, orders that have not contributed to redress for survivors and who have closed down their records and, spent a lot of money on legal teams, to fight these not fight investigations, but, to protect themselves and their institutions. So yes, they're the individuals within the religious orders, but these religious orders are institutions and in many ways businesses who are set up to protect themselves. There was one nun I spoke to who said that the church thinks in centuries and that this generation was lost to them, but they'd get the next. I remember sitting in with the Bon Secours sisters in Cork who were evangelizing and trying to bring in young people but didn't really want to speak about the more than 800 children who were still died in Tuam and whose bodies are still in sewage chambers on the grounds. I was just in Tuam at a memorial there the other day where survivors who have family members who may be buried in these sewage chambers were reading out the names of the hundreds of children. And it really, when you stand there with your back hurting because it's taking so long to read out the number of children's names, it really hits you, just the extent of it, the extent of children who died, the extent of the silence, and the money spent by religious orders on PR companies and on legal support to quash investigations by people like Catherine Corliss and to silence the experiences of survivors. And we still have, strange, lack of accountability when it comes to illegal adoptions. We had, the Commission of Investigation to Mother and Baby Homes issue its report and say that it found no evidence of illegal adoptions, while at the same time the Marion Reynolds report was completed, which found that there were tens of thousands of illegal adoption cases. And Marion Reynolds herself said she didn't want to put her name to the report if the institutions and agencies involved in those illegal adoptions were not named. And yet, those in power decided to publish that report without naming institutions responsible. So there's still such an institutional silence. And I remember when there were nuns arrested in Scotland, it was around the time that the Pope visited Ireland, and I remember survivors just being in awe of that there were nuns actually arrested and, maybe made to testify about what happened and the abuses in these institutions. And we've never seen that here. There was one time in the High Court, I remember there was a Sister Fahy who was due to testify at a case about illegal adoption, a terrible case where, a mother had been searching for years and years for her son who was illegally adopted through the Sisters of Charity agency, and their institution, again, not covered under the commission. And the religious order settled the morning that the sister was due to take the stand. So, a real attempt to avoid any public testimony on the part of the religious orders as to their role and to be held accountable.
Incredibly, it's already 11:45, so I'm going to throw it open to the floor in just a moment. But before that, I want to ask each of you about your relationship with social media. It strikes me social media can be very useful, certainly for journalists. I'm not so sure about historians. It can also be dangerous. You're not a fan, Diarmaid?
Well, I'm not blind to how it facilitates communication, and I'm well aware of the kind of world that many of our students are growing up in. And there have been positives there. My difficulty is when we're talking about very complex and sensitive issues here, which are hugely important to all of us in terms of coming to terms with public and private pasts. I don't think you can do that through social media very effectively. There has been, during the period I've been looking at, these constant and emotive, very short and often very bilious appraisals of very complex issues. And of course, people can use social media in that way to distort history. And propaganda is what most of it is, masquerading as fact. There isn't any accountability when it comes to evidence or showing the evidence or accuracy. Unfortunately, that's the landscape we're talking about now. So I suppose I came to see it as quite an enemy of history. And there are, nonetheless, of course, particularly more recent developments which are frightening in terms of the control of social media and the abuse of power. And most of what we've been talking about today is about power and abuse of power and calling people to account for it. And it is out of control now, and it's dangerous.
Mick, you're still a member of the Twitter ally.
Part-time, I've got rid of it, my phone, but for the work's sake, I keep in it. I agree with most of what Deirdre said. One quick point you made about Bertie Ahern earlier. I was being interviewed by an English journalist there last year, and he made a point. He was talking about Bertie Ahern, and he said, 3/4 of the entries to Wikipedia about Ahern concerned his money was. And he says, is that how he's going to be remembered? I just said to myself, well, that says far more about Wikipedia than it does anything about Bertie Ahern. In other words, you have social media now putting a version out there that is completely distorted. And in that instance, quite obviously, I think I agree with you, the long-term view of him will far more to do with the peace process than to do with money. But the current view is that as a result of social media. On the slightly positive side, as somebody who tries to, as you know, Frank, you have to try and stay across everything. I'm fascinated when I come across stuff, archival stuff, and particular interest of mine is Irish immigrants to the UK back in the 50s and 60s. And I access that stuff on social media, and it's gold. Now, in the normal run of events, I personally probably wouldn't have come across it. So I find that fascinating. But overall, it is extremely dangerous in the narrative that it's putting out there about history, I'd suggest.
Caelainn, are you a social media enthusiast?
I have a 10-month-old baby at home, so I'm trying to stay off it more and more because he just is fixated on the phone. But yeah, I think it's mixed. I would prefer to be off it, but I have seen how social media has been a place for survivors to come together and form communities and share information in a way that has been incredibly important for people. It's also been a very hostile environment for many people as well. In that regard, it can be really critical for sharing information that might not otherwise be known about through official channels. But at the same time, I think a point of sort of how it's controlled and how it's monitored is a really interesting point about the Department of Justice, I think. Through an FOI, it was found to be tracking anyone on social media who mentioned mother and baby homes as well as direct provision, which I think there's a direct parallel between the two and how we continue to warehouse and institutionalize people for profit. And you know, I've obviously met many survivors through social media. I've reached out to people who would otherwise be afraid to come forward. And going back to the point I made about Ruhama, this anti-prostitution agency, it was sex worker rights activists I would have talked to through and met through social media who, you know, have talked to me about how much harm that agency set up by nuns is doing in their opinion, you know, believing that that religious, you know, founded agency is still denying sex workers agency and supporting policy that they believe really harms sex workers. So, you know, it is a forum in which I have met many people and managed to strike up conversations with survivors whose testimonies have been incredibly important to writing the book. And at the same time, the surveillance and the control of that media is significant and worrying.
I suppose taking the long view, and again, and I take that point, is an important one about bringing people together. But I think the big irony of social media is just how isolating it has been for a particular generation who've grown up with it, because an awful lot of the time it actually involves a retreat for them socially, that they are actually refraining from other forms of communication, which are a hell of a lot more important.
Does anybody want to ask a question? Do we need a mic for... Yes, we have a mic. Is this man here? Or, well, sorry, you can start. There's one down in the middle.